Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the October 2022 40k Balance Dataslate, and specifically we're going to be talking about what it means for the Craftworld Eldar. Now, I know that Craftworld Eldar didn't get a direct buff, which is a little sad. I was hoping for some minor tweaks to certain units, or Craftworlds, but didn't quite get that. What we did get, however, was nerfs to some of the factions that are the hardest for Craftworld Eldar to deal with. So, we are going to be taking a deep dive into that and what it means for the Craftworld Eldar going forward competitively. So a quick overview of this video, we're going to be looking at the Balance Dataslate and what changes were made. We're going to be looking at how these changes specifically affect Craftworlds and Harlequins. We are going to look at Harlequins in this as well. And we are going to be looking at what the change means for the game going forward and what GW's philosophy is going to be on these Balance Dataslates going forward, because obviously we can tell a lot from what they have done so far. So first on the chopping block, of course, was Tyranids. Now, everyone knew they were going to be, because they were pretty much the dominant force in tournaments. I believe they were actually number one in tournament placements. And the primary Hive Fleet that was responsible for most of these wins was, of course, Hive Fleet Leviathan. You know, the scary one with all the big monsters, synapse creatures, and warriors and things like that. That one was what they targeted. And I actually do like what they did, because basically what it does is it changes the Hive Fleet adaptation to only affect synapse monsters. So not synapse creatures in general. So basically Tyranid warriors and other non-monster synapse creatures no longer benefit from the army-wide special rule, which basically meant that wounds of 1 to 3 always fail irrespective of any abilities or weapons the attackers may have. So this wasn't a very great ability in my opinion, because it really limited the amount of weapons that could actually be used against things like Tyranid warriors. Things like, for example, scatter lasers, which would normally be pretty effective against Tyranid warriors, were a little bit less effective when running against this Hive Fleet. So I'm actually glad they changed this. Basically makes it a little bit easier for Eldar heavy weapons to target and kill synapse creatures that are not monsters. So things like Tyranids and stuff like that. And it also really makes a lot more sense from a rules perspective, as Tyranid warriors and zoanthropes and things like that were much less tough than the monsters were, and they got a lot more use out of this ability. More use than I thought they really should have had. So I'm glad they actually made this change. This opens up a lot of other weapons that are going to be effective against those creatures from our arsenals. Now, the second part of this was the Reaper of Obliterax. So basically, the Reaper of Obliterax's ability is limited to a max of 3 mortal wounds. I've actually never really seen this do that much personally on a personal level, so I can't really relate to the nerf, but it does seem like it's a fairly standard mortal wounds nerf. It was just dealing a little bit too many mortal wounds, basically 4 to 5 per round. They limited that to 3 per round. The next change we saw was actually a buff to Space Marines. Basically, there's not much to say on this, just that one of their secondary objectives got buffed to 4 victory points if they score on it, so it makes it a little bit easier for Space Marines to get victory points in their games. I don't think this is going to affect the faction too much. I think there's just too much codex creep with them right now at the moment. Even with Armor of Contempt and things like that, I think that some factions within the Space Marines are still struggling a bit. And next is, of course, a nerf to the second strongest faction in the game, Harlequins. And I actually think this nerf is not really that bad. And I know some Harlequin players will disagree and say that, this was, integral to killing the key units in an enemy army before the game has even begun and if they get first turn and so forth, which is true, right? You basically can no longer do that. So basically what the nerf is units and Star Weavers that are embarked within, after moving and advancing, can no longer shoot as if they were stationary. And that's basically what the Lights to Death gives you, right? It basically allows units that make a normal move or advance in the following shooting phase to count as stationary. So this no longer applies if the unit is embarked within a transport. So that transport can't move really fast, 16 inches, advance 6 inches, for a total of 22 inches. And then on top of that, have the unit inside be able to shoot at a key character or target or things like that. So basically you can no longer pull off these insane turn 1 threat ranges where you're getting units in range to shoot enemies turn 1 with fusion pistols and stuff like that. Which I can see why that's a significant nerf, but it's not a nerf that's really going to cripple the army. I thought that maybe they'd be targeting, stratagems or stuff like that, increasing the command cost of different stratagems that Harlequins have access to, or the points costs of different pivotal roles and things. So I'm glad they actually did not do this, and they didn't provide a more widespread nerf to the Harlequins. So I'm actually okay with this change. However, if there are any Harlequin players listening to this that might disagree and might think this nerf is a little bit more harsh than I might think, please do leave it in the comment section. Again, I do play Harlequins a little bit, but I'm not an expert in them, so I'd appreciate the expertise on it if you have it. So next up is a buff to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Now, as some of you might know, the Adeptus Mechanicus for a while were a powerhouse faction that basically had a good matchup against everybody and were very strong. They got nerfed into the ground a while back, a couple of data sheets ago, and to this day, they've been struggling, basically. They've been right down there with Space Marines as far as tournament win rate. So basically what GW did was they said, okay, we're just going to revert all the previous nerfs. So do I think it's enough for Adeptus Mechanicus to get back into the tournament scene and compete? Absolutely. I think we'll see that they'll probably be within 45 to maybe 48% win rate after this. That's my opinion. I don't know exactly how things are going to shake out, but I think they'll be significantly stronger after this, and they'll be in a less weak spot, personally. However, I still don't think this is enough to bring them to a top faction. I don't think they're going to be competing with anything like Tyranids or Necrons as far as the secondary game goes, but they are going to be a bit stronger in some ways. And lastly, of course, we have a nerf to Necrons. So this was a pretty minor nerf. I was expecting, basically them to target the objective secured abilities and stuff like that of the faction. Specifically speaking, the pre-game move combined with the army-wide objective secured, I thought they were going to nerf those custom dynasty traits, personally. But they instead chose to fix this, which is an unintentional rule interaction, which basically means that character vehicles with the core ability can sometimes, under some circumstances, be resurrected by certain abilities or affected by certain buffs. So in some lists, people were resurrecting command barges. In some lists, people were resurrecting, the Menentheers of the Silent King. So if any of you don't know, the Menentheers are basically anti-tank weapons attached to the Silent King, which is a massive model in terms of power. So they got rid of the Necrons' ability to do this, so they can no longer resurrect the Menentheers and the Catacomb Command barges and things like that. So that's a needed fix. I think obviously that was something that was not intentional. And, obviously GW didn't want people to be resurrecting 100 plus points worth of models from one ability. That's not what they intended with this. So luckily this changed, but the Necrons' ability to score on secondary objectives very easily and control the game on objectives has not changed whatsoever, and I think that this minor change won't really affect them that much overall. I think it will obviously affect their win rate slightly, but not by a drastic amount. As most of the time Necrons were winning, they were losing the battle in other areas, but winning the battle in objectives. So I think that's where they're going to stay. So the real question is, how do these changes specifically affect Craftworlds and Harlequins? So I touched on it a little bit before, but I think that Craftworld Eldar are going to be particularly affected by the nerfs to Tyranids. So this will allow Craftworld units to more reliably damage Tyranid warriors and zoanthropes in battle. Again, the Eldar's ability to deal damage is one of our main strengths, and we need to be able to deal damage to units like this so that we can control the board much easier. On the other hand, the nerf to Harlequins will give Craftworld Eldar players a bit more breathing room in that matchup on turn 1. So there's no more zooming forward with the Star Weaver and blasting a key target off the board turn 1 with the clowns inside. So you can no longer run up, put 2 fusion pistols into a Farseer's face, and laugh all the way to the circus, right? You can't do that really anymore. turn 1 at least, so this gives Eldar a little bit more breathing room in that regard. As for the Harlequins, they won't be able to perform as much of an alpha strike with units and Starweavers, and they won't be able to remain as safe as if they want to shoot. They're going to have to move out of the Starweavers at some point, and their threat range is going to be slightly reduced as well when it comes to their ranged attacks. Other than that, not much has changed. The other Cadets are pretty much unchanged. Twilight and Dark are still pretty good, and especially Twilight I can see being more popular now that the Light Cadets is a little bit nerfed, but even so, I still think the Light Cadets is very strong. I think that it's still pretty competitive. I just think that, this trick was something that the Light Cadets did really well, and now that it can't do it anymore, maybe we'll see players going towards something else. So before I end the video, I do want to talk about the biggest elephant in the room here when it comes to these changes, and that is, what do they mean for the game going forward? So there's a couple of things I want to mention here. So first of all, GW is clearly going to only target factions with the highest and lowest win rates. So this was pretty clear, right? They didn't really touch any factions in the middle, even if those factions had bad interactions or things that were possibly affecting them negatively. And this, in my opinion, going forward is not the greatest thing for GW. And I think GW has to recognize that just because there are factions that are doing really well and really bad in the tournament scene doesn't mean that negative interactions don't exist elsewhere and that they don't need to look for them. And the statement that GW has basically made here by doing this is they're saying that we're only really going to look at the top and lowest performing factions in the game as far as the tournament scene goes to try to root out these unwanted and negative characterizations or interactions, which honestly just isn't the best way to go about it. And let me give you an example. I don't know if you guys know this game, but this is a game I used to play a lot. It's League of Legends. Maybe some of you know it, maybe some of you don't. But it's basically a game that always has balance updates, right? And the thing about this game that I used to enjoy was that all of these balance updates were always aimed at targeting negative interactions, no matter how good or competitive or bad that character was at that moment. There was always an effort to try to balance each and every character when they could find the problems that existed. And I think GW needs to do this as well and take this into their mind. They can't just look at the top tournament armies and only make changes on those. They need to really take a deeper look at all of the factions together and see if there's any negative interactions at play so that they can fix those and create a better experience for the community. The next thing about the changes is that they're probably going forward going to be very minor and targeted. So if we look at the Tyranid changes, yes, that was a big change, but it was only a change to one hive fleet and only one part of that special rule, right? So again, the most dominating and unintentional interactions are going to be targeted, but a vast majority of the lesser interactions that might be negative but not too negative might be left behind. And lastly, internal unit balance is clearly not something they're going to be looking at too much across all factions, as no faction really got a direct buff or nerf to any of their units outside of course, the Adeptus Mechanicus. And the only reason they got that was because in former data slates, those units were severely nerfed. So again, those are going to benefit units from the Adeptus Mechanicus, but not directly. So what I think we can definitely say here is that going forward, these data slates are not going to be targeting individual units. They're not going to be targeting units like Dark Reapers who clearly need a rework and need to be fixed. They're not going to be targeting units like Guardians or Storm Guardians or anything like that because they're only going to be looking at rules interactions and clearly overpowered things in tournaments. So, and maybe, tuning up the more underpowered armies with something somewhat short of a direct unit buff. And honestly, Space Marines, they can be a very strong faction in some hands, but the problem with Space Marines right now is they just have a lot of codex creep, and what we didn't see is we didn't see GW buffing a lot of their units. We really just saw a small change in one of their objectives to give them slightly more victory points. The Adeptus Mechanicus is an army that they did change units with, but again, they only changed them because they were changed or nerfed in a previous data slate. So unfortunately, we're definitely not going to see any real work being done towards internal unit balance with these data slate changes. We're not going to see that from Eldar, and we're probably not going to see that from any faction, no matter how poorly they're doing. So we can definitely understand that GW is in a place where they don't want to actually change things too much. And I kind of get this in a way. I know GW doesn't want to shake things up too much and change the meta too much and create a massive problem unintentionally. But again, I do think these changes need to happen at some point. And if they don't, we're probably going to have to wait until 10th edition for it, which could be all the way next year, and probably most likely will be towards, at the earliest, the end of summer. And honestly, guys, that is a long time to wait. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens, I guess, in the new expansion that's going to come out after Nephilim. We'll have to wait for those point decreases and rules changes then. But it's my opinion that they're really not going to focus too much on rule changes, and in the next expansion, they might only do points changes where they think they are necessary, which is kind of a bummer. So in conclusion, while overall I'm not really mad at the changes, I certainly think some were warranted. I don't think GW is looking deep enough into the internal unit balance of the codexes as a whole, which again, they talked about addressing in their MetaWatch video, but clearly they did not implement that, and I don't know if they actually are. GW has a bad track record with things like this, which they talk about doing something, but then they end up falling short of it or not doing it. And I think, honestly, that's probably just GW getting too ahead of itself with what they actually want to do versus what they end up doing. But sadly, this means we're going to have to wait until the next expansion to see more changes to underused or underperforming units. So units like Dark Reapers, or in some cases, some variants of Wraithguard or Guardians or things like that, are going to have to wait a little bit more to see them brought into focus with the rest of the 40k factions. And I have to say, I do think Wraithguard are probably one of those units that only need a slight points decrease. I'm more looking at Storm Guardians, Guardian Defenders that is, and of course, I'm looking at the most notorious offender, Dark Reapers, right? I'm looking at those units because those units are really the units that need the most help, in my opinion, in the Eldar Codex. But, you know, not only just for Eldar, but for other factions out there as well. There are so many units across all the codexes that could probably use slight buffs or major buffs to become usable again. And I really hope the GW does this, because not only is it a big moneymaker for them as far as selling different units, think about it. If they rebalance Dark Reapers, I mean, from a financial perspective, how much more money would they be making on the new Dark Reaper kits? Probably a lot of money, right? So it's not for nothing. Their work's not going to go to waste by doing it. And it really doesn't make much sense not to do something with it. So I hope they end up, siding with common sense, fixing Dark Reapers, taking the time to fix Dark Reapers, fix Storm Guardians a little bit, and maybe look outward to other codexes to fix the units that aren't so great with those codexes, right? And of course, I'm sure that your fellow players that play other factions will list off 2 or 3 units in their codexes that suck too and that probably need a little bit of a buff. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. If you do have any comments about the data slate that you want to mention, go ahead and leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear your comments as usual. I love responding to your guys' stuff. And I will see you guys next time. Have a good one. We have more content planned for next week, and stay tuned. All right, peace out, everybody. See you later.